the one that really started any kind of this like disgust towards the idea of men doing drag or whatever, that probably was the root spawner of a lot of this kind of thing. And it's like, okay, well, in that case, is that the worst representation? Because that's the one that triggered this cascade that led us to where we are today.
Yeah, if you go further enough back, it's just the differentiation between man and woman that would innately then be the cause. Before we dive properly in, I'd love to just kind of warm up really just by saying thank you so much for your time today. I know you must be very busy. I've from what I've seen online and like the little research I've done, it doesn't look like you've done this many kind of little kind of projects outside of your stuff. Am I missing any, or is that like the right vibe?
I did an interview for somebody 4 months back, I think, or something. They just messaged me and were like, hey, I've got a small YouTube channel, would you mind coming on and doing a video, like an interview? And I was like, yeah, I mean, I don't mind. I don't really. It's an hour of me talking about myself, so that's easy, realistically. I love talking about myself. It was either just after I released the brief look at Twilight, or as I was releasing the brief look at Twilight. So the only thing I was really known for was the Harry Potter one, and then the two trans videos that I had, the How I Met Your Mother and the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which both kind of blew up a month and a half, 2 months after Harry Potter. I wasn't very well known for like a specific kind of content by that point. 25,000 subs at that point, I think, so around there. It was midway through the year, but it was still pretty early in the year as far as me making content goes. So it was like the interview was like fine, but it was just there wasn't much for me to talk about because I hadn't really done a lot. I mean, it's easy to get in contact with me if people want to do collaborations, but I'm not the person who's has the capability currently to put myself out there and do it.
It's very fair enough. But that's one nice thing you mentioned about the Harry Potter video. Once it's out, and it can be a lot of work to put them together. But they are kind of up there for forever, and there's something quite relaxing about that. It's almost a relief to know that even if the hard work doesn't pay off initially with like view counts and stuff, like it's there, it's a piece of art, and it's up forever, which is nice.
Yeah, I mean, it's up forever unless you delete the channel maybe, which I totally haven't done twice. As long as they stay up and the internet allows them to stay up, then yes, they're there forever, haunting you.
So, well, I'll make like an official start then. But and again, I can't really thank you enough. I always feel so humble talking to these larger creators, obviously yourself included. And I'd love to talk about obviously YouTube, but obviously your Twitter presence as well. I think it's quite a nice juxtaposition from the very consistent and I don't know, like very well themed videos that are so, like I say, consistent. And then the Twitter, it kind of just is where I felt like I could really see your political voice just kind of quite obviously just coming out. So I'd love to talk about all of it. Something that really kind of speaks to me with your content specifically is being brought up on predominantly, American and obviously British media. The representation of trans characters has obviously had a direct correlation and connection to my life, but I would love to discuss how you feel it's changed, because I have my own, opinions of characters I've seen, things done well, things done not so well. In a general sense, so that we can have that bigger discussion, how do you feel that trans representation in the mainstream media has kind of changed direction in the past few decades, and in the past 30 years or so?
There's sort of like 4 sort of main stages, as far as I can see from the analysis that I've done, obviously in the videos I've reviewed and whatnot, wherein you kind of have the pre-90s sort of period of trans media representation, wherein a lot of the characters are they exist. Sometimes it's pretty bad, like sometimes they're sex worker victims or they're serial killer villains. But also a lot of times it's just sort of like random small characters, like in Love Boat or Golden Girls, where their transness is kind of a little bit of a novelty, but it's not taken to an extreme of like being overtly aggressive or violent towards that trans person. And then sort of around the 90s flowing into the 2000s, what you saw sort of beginning with the... I always hit this film because I always mix up with Boys Don't Cry, which is, of course, obviously another trans-related film, which does have at its core the idea of a trans man being violently attacked and other things that I probably can't say because you need to put a trigger warning for them, but bad things happening to them. And The Crying Game is the Irish film that I'm thinking of. The Crying Game, which is about a trans woman in England and an IRA soldier, and one of the key parts of that film is when the soldier finds out that the trans woman is trans and proceeds to hit her and then vomit in the toilet. A scene that you'll see replicated in Ace Ventura, in Family Guy. So that's kind of like one that I think became quite mainstreamed. That response became a big thing, and that was sort of replicated throughout a lot of the trans representation of the 90s to 2000s, which was more overt, open disgust from cis men towards that, which you can really see emphasized in stuff like How I Met Your Mother and Ted Mosby. That then sort of transitioned into the sort of initial mainstreaming of trans identity, which a lot of people pinpoint as around sort of 2015, 2016, with characters like the one played by Laverne Cox in Orange is the New Black. So that was like the big one of like, there's these finally characters that are like attempting to play a more sympathetic version of trans narratives and trans stories. And then since sort of then we're sort of hitting into and that was sort of like, it was initial wave and rise of like that a more kinder version and a more involved version from trans people in telling those stories. And we've now sort of moved into one where we have trans people involved, people are more aware of trans issues and trans identity, and now it's kind of finding its foot between the authentic stories people are trying to tell and the mainstream media sort of corporate spin on it that's trying to effectively cash in on that progressive view. Cheap kind of stories where a lot of times it's just the corporations seem like they want to get a pat on the back for the fact that they put in a character and made them use, I don't know, they, them pronouns or something without really bothering to like tell anything more of a story than that. So that's, I mean, those are sort of like as far as I'm aware, the like changing form of like trans representation over the past 30 to 40-ish years of media, from what I've seen.
Hearing such a nice and concise summary, it does obviously feel like it's going in a good direction, and it feels like progress in terms of obviously less harm to trans people as a result. It seems like that's the direction we're going in. Would you agree, or would you say that it's actually more harmful now, that we are seeing higher hate crimes for trans people because representation is so much more known? Like, where would you say the state of things lies now?
I'd say that it is generally more positive than it has been in the past. It's a mixture of it's more positive than that period of time where it was very aggressive, and it's more versed in the ideas of gender identity and the sort of science that we have around that, the social science around that, than the 90s/80s stuff, which was a little bit vague on terminology. Sometimes it often mixed up drag queens and transgender people into sort of a big amorphous blob of generic queerness. So we've kind of improved upon both of those, and there's like the rise of obviously the hate crimes thing. I think that's more often, I would tie that more than anything, not to the fact that there's worse media representation, because I don't think that's true, but more specifically to the fact that we're getting better records of hate crimes. Like, I think it would be silly to assume that those hate crimes didn't happen in the past, and we just, either people didn't go to the cops because they were rightfully worried about police involvement, or the police just didn't record it at all and just sort of wrote it off and didn't think about it. So, and then also I guess one could argue that there is a backlash to the progressive representation from people, where people are angry that they're seeing this kind of stuff now, rather than seeing the what they expect to see from stuff like How I Met Mother or South Park in the past.
Sure. And we can see that, in terms of intersectionality happening across the board, reactions to seeing more people of colour in characterisation and women in leading roles in gaming and stuff. There is that backlash. That's a really great point. So if I may then, going back to some of those milestones, as it were, those stages in the past that I very much myself remember growing up with and kind of witnessing more towards the 90s section. I think probably one of the most famous, and obviously one you've covered brilliantly on with your episode, is the Ace Ventura one. And when you said about that kind of gag reflex reaction from a cis male to a trans body, a female trans body, I think that Ace Ventura one, it does bring that kind of visceral memory back of that scene. Don't think a scene like that could just be released now. I think that there would be an outcry, not just by circles that are instantly affected, but by allies and other people as well, just saying this is just hateful, this is horrid. But can you tell me anything more about how you felt with, watching that scene? I mean, what do you think in terms of that being replicated again? Do you think that kind of scene is out of the question anymore?
I would say that in general mainstream, that scene would probably get, I would assume, cut off by whatever the HR department of any sort of company that would have that come through. They would probably step in and say that this is going to lead to a backlash, and generally speaking, evidence showcases that explicitly anti-trans stuff isn't necessarily that profitable for larger companies. Getting progressive backlash isn't a massive profit generator for places like Disney or whatever, so they normally try to avoid annoying anybody realistically. But I'd imagine that scene would get stopped before it even got to the point where it was considering, before crowds of people were getting involved in that. As to whether it couldn't get produced anymore, I mean, there's people like Steven Crowder who are making videos that are effectively built around the exact same premise still to this day, so I would say that there are groups of people within society that absolutely still relate to and still engage with that kind of humour. Yeah,
I mean, Matt Walsh's documentary, What is a Woman? It's an intellectual way of asking the same thing, isn't it, really? Because I think it does tie in with all of these, the Steven Crowders, the Matt Walshes, even down to Graham Linehan, I can't pronounce his name. Because I think that a lot of what my points are in a lot of my video essays and stuff is that there's a clear fascination to the trans female body, as opposed to, in the entire umbrella term of transgender, trans men, non-binary folk, gender fluid, there are so many other elements of that. Even further than what would be called once cross-dressers and stuff, going as far as to analyse that, there seems to be an obsession with a trans female body with some form of some surgeries done. I think you can kind of see where I'm getting with that. And a lot of the response comes to a kind of almost a visceral disgust in the form of a gag reflex, and the spitting in Ace Ventura and the kind of retching and stuff like that. And again, obviously YouTube friendly, but how much do you think that that's alluding to the kind of mysticism between the mysticism around kind of oral sex, and how that's kind of a kind of fetishized version of what a trans woman's body is from a questioning cis male perspective? Do you think there's a link there, or do you think that that's just a random reaction that people are doing?
It's like an attempt to cleanse from the system what is effectively realistically not necessarily internalized transphobia, also not internalized because that's obviously internalized is referring to the transphobia that trans people have, but the subconscious transphobia that people have, but is more, if anything, subconscious homophobia. Because for many of those cis men in those stories, they're not viewing the trans woman as a woman, they're viewing this as a case of they were tricked into making out with a man, and therefore they are now gay, and they need to purge that gayness from them through an act of expulsion like that. So I think that's probably more of a core element there is remembering the positioning that the movie or the TV show puts trans women into, which is that it doesn't acknowledge trans women as a woman. So it is. I think it is more, if anything, rooted in homophobia.
There's clearly a subsection of specifically the right-wing pundits that have, rumours behind them, and obviously it's not for us to question or anything, but if there is that kind of sense of you can pray the gay away, then there is clearly going to be a subsection of right-wing pundits that are praying the gay away and have that kind of questioning element to them. So for them, a trans woman, as you said yourself, as they see it, someone that was a man but is now attractive, you can see how that, like, our existence just blurs the lines entirely just by existing, even though we don't intend to be,
So I'd also argue that there is eroticism in exoticism. So generally speaking, a lot of people find things that are considered to be outliers in society, or like strange or weird, erotic in some form, because of the taboo nature of them. Or the distant relation they hold to the accepted norms of society. So I think that probably plays a big part too in the way that there are conservative or right-leaning people who get found to have transgender pornography on their computers or whatever. I think there's probably elements of the forbiddenness of that idea that probably tantalizes. And that applies to a huge range of groups. It's not really explicit, I think, to any particular one.
Amazing. So that got really deep really fast, which is really good. So kind of winding it back then just at the top level so we can expand more as we go. But of all of the media you've both analysed and seen, and it sounds like we've seen similar stuff growing up and everything, I'd love to hear your kind of best and worst. I know that's a bit of a simple question, but there'll be surely stuff we can develop into. But what would you say? I mean, would you say Ace Ventura is the worst depiction of trans representation? I mean, you didn't... In the video you said that, that it's not, in some ways, the worst if you analyse it from different angles. What would you say is?
I think that it's sort of almost the white whale of representation, in that you're probably going to keep consistently finding things that when you dig into them, you're like, oh, this might actually be worse because of additional factors around it. Like I said, the obvious thing with the Ace Ventura thing is that, like mentioned by a lot of people, I mean, that scene and that idea is inspired specifically. It's parodying, not necessarily parodying, but it is incorporating the direct scene of The Crying Game. So, in that case, is The Crying Game the worst one then, seeing as The Crying Game is the one that caused Ace Ventura to put that scene in the first place, and then that led to that. But then you look at it and you say, okay, well, these ideas didn't crop up in the 90s. They weren't, they didn't appear then. If you dig back decades ago, you could go back to Silence of the Lambs with Buffalo Bill and say, okay, well, here's a character where there is this almost idea of this serial killer who kills and skins women to wear them because that's what they want to try and be, that kind of thing. So is this the cause of that, or is it Psycho, where you've got this other serial killer who dresses up as their mother due to some deep mental issues? Is that the root cause of this kind of the way that we sort of the villainization almost of any sort of gender variance or femininity within men, and it's or femininity within people? I say it gets complex when you start getting to that one, obviously, because it's like viewed from their perspective, it's like the thing of like trans women are effectively viewed from a patriarchal conservative perspective, going back that far, as men who adopt femininity, which is why it's so demonized generally, because it's femininity is viewed as the lesser, so it's almost men demeaning themselves down to that position, which is why it's viewed so aggressively and normally reacted so strongly, because it's antithetical to what men have been taught about themselves and about society. Which is, I find opposed to normally, like with trans men, where normally what you see is pity. Like, oh, here's a woman trying to be a man, but she'll never be able to successfully do it as well as men can do it. And we pity them for trying to get above their station. And so it's all rooted in that kind of cause. And so I feel like if you dig back far enough, you could probably find I don't know, some text from 500 years ago that might be the one that really started any kind of this like disgust towards the idea of men doing drag or whatever, that probably was the root spawner of a lot of this kind of thing. And it's like, okay, well, in that case, is that the worst representation? Because that's the one that triggered this cascade that led us to where we are today.
Yeah, if you go further enough back, it's just the differentiation between, man and woman that would innately then be the cause. Because as soon as you've created a lesser, you have therefore created a separation between them, and any movement between two levels is innately going to be seen as a wrong or correct move. I get where you're going. That's amazing. That's an amazing point. And so from that entire side of your argument then, would you say then that the more evil form of representation is one which then creates a ripple effect of other media copying said representation? So would you say that your point there is that it's the initial kind of core idea of transphobia that is worse because it's ignited a flame of transphobia onward?
I generally use the idea of worst normally in titles just to make them sound snazzy and clickbaity, rather than it being an actual position that I try and take during the video, because I think it's almost impossible to pinpoint the worst. And I would argue that probably the worst trans representation is the one that we learn nothing from. If you're looking back at bad representation, the example is always, here are things to try and avoid. Here are things to try and get better with, to try and understand why this is flawed, why this is an issue. And with good representation, it's always a case of, okay, well, this was great. What could be done to be like this? What could be done to improve upon this? Is this the perfect one? Could it never get any better than this? Because that's almost an oxymoron. I don't think you can have a perfect representation. It could always probably be better.
With that in mind, it's hard for me to then ask what's the best form of representation, but kind of then channeling the question into what we've just discussed, what kind of scene or what episode do you feel then kind of ignited the other side? So it, ignited a kind of movement towards more understanding. It gave trans people the voice. It took away the gaze from the male perspective that felt trapped and put the voice with the character that got to explain her side of things. I mean, does anything there kind of come to mind?
I enjoyed 2.5 Men's Bill. I thought that was a sort of a fascinating look at a trans man that didn't necessarily involve putting them down, didn't involve necessarily making them feel bad about themselves, and he was able to, and it was the end of the episode resolved with him continuing to have a relationship with an older woman and still being friends with his friend from the past. So it's like, yeah, I think there's plenty of examples that you can find of ones that were positive. I guess it's defining it by the best, I think, is always a tricky one, because I think it's going to vary from person to person, and I haven't sat down and thought to myself, what is the best one? Because no matter how many people keep asking me to do a tier list of them, I'm never going to do that. It's in the same way that I don't do any serious scoring. I do joke scoring at the end, because scoring it is a silly metric by which you should judge it. The conclusion is the judgment. If you can't work it out from that, you're not going to work it out.
No, that it's all very relative, isn't it? I think. I mean, when I was preparing for this, I thought, like, trying to define that myself, what is the worst version of it? And I brought it back to what depiction would create the most harm to the trans community. I really, ironically, think that the most harm isn't created by a specific episode per se or a specific scene, but it is done by the creators behind it that go on these hell-bent journeys to take down the community. And even just saying that, I'm sure a few people come to mind. But I'd love to talk about, like, the Graham line and the J.K. Rowling situation, and this what has now become in the West an entire movement to take down the trans community. Words like eradication have been uttered by Michael Knowles and such. Do you think that media has a place to battle that, and that this positive representation of trans characters is helping towards that movement?
I guess the thing to view with the media, and I think this does feed somewhat into that idea of trying to pinpoint a singular one, is that media can combat that, but it's a sort of overarching combative element wherein you need to have repeated representation that is positive or good or showcasing a accurate or realistic representation. Because when you say good, a lot of people get stuck on that idea that like the trans narrative can't be bad, or the trans person can't be a villain, or can't be something like that, which is absolutely not true. It's just that the incorporation of the trans person in that way needs to be done in such a form that doesn't just fall back on tired old stereotypes, that reiterate those points that help to feed the anti-trans campaigns you see right now. So media changing, I think, helps to adjust that, especially because it helps to give people who don't have those connections with trans people a way in which they can form a sort of through media relationship. A lot of people don't have trans people in their lives that they can talk to, that they can ask questions, that they can put a human face to that community of. And so having positive representation can do a great work towards giving them that. I think a great example of that is from a different community, somewhat, is Brokeback Mountain, which for a lot of people helped to humanize and to give a human face to the crisis that a lot of gay men felt. And sort of helped to fuel that idea of, oh, these aren't just a stereotype, these aren't just a joke or a monster hiding in the toilets. They're people with human lives that have human bonds and that can grieve like humans as well. So I think that sort of stuff helps, and that's kind of a big part of what media can and should be doing to combat that, is changing the sort of general background noise that helps to influence the way people connect with a community.
A great word that you just used there, which I think might be a great point, is the humanization. And I think that, to bring up the word genocide, unfortunately, one of the stages of genocide being the dehumanization of a community, of a subcategory of people. It makes sense that to combat that, the humanization is going to be a huge key. And as you say, if most people's understanding of a trans character is just what they see on in mass media, then they're never going to have a true understanding of really what a trans person goes through. And I know that to be true from my lived experience. People say that to me, and they'll say in person to me, I didn't really get it until I met you. And for example, people that have known me before I transitioned, I used to be told frequently, like, you should have been born a woman. There's nothing manly about you. And I would not even broach the subject, and they would say to me, are you sure you're happy as you are? And so I think that human connection can go such a long way, which is really interesting. We are seeing those kind of humanized characters coming out. I watched the Powerpuff Girls episode you did recently about the unicorn character, and as some good and bad points within it, but it did still give so much more of a voice to the journey behind so-called transitioning. Obviously it wasn't a canon trans character, but we're seeing much more given to the voice of the person themselves, like Laverne Cox's character in Orange is the New Black. We more lines of dialogue, more explanation to the journey, and I guess would you say that's one step closer to the humanization of trans people?
Yeah, I would say that it's the giving a voice, letting them have a narrative that reflects actual attitudes and actual issues and the actual experiences is important to that. And I think that the biggest concern with that now is ensuring that in the attempt to do that we don't just fall into a similar concern as what was happening with the stereotyping that was bad, wherein it ended up painting this idea that of all trans people looking the same or being the same. So in the positivity, I think we also need to try to make sure it's not monolithic positivity, that we really do try to emphasize this idea that many people have different stories, have many different transitions, that the end point or the end goal or how they go throughout their lives are not going to be the same. I think that's a big essential part to having lots of stories, is having lots of different stories.
And that goes into the meaning of diversity, doesn't it? And not having token characters that are, taken at face value. They have a single line to tell them the characters, and then that's nothing, no more. And that actually brings me to one of the questions I had prepared, and maybe we can round it off then if you're short for time. But I wanted to talk about the kind of the before and after factor that we see in media quite a lot, and that shock factor that gets the clicks, it gets the views. Way back when it sold the magazines. What's your opinion on that? Because I think that anyone that knows anything about the trans community knows it's not a before and after. You don't take a pill and wake up the next day looking like a hot Matrix character. Unfortunately, if it were that easy, we would all be doing it, I'm sure. But where do you think that obviously the shock factor being a main point, but where do you think that came from in the media? Do you think there was any other underlying reasons why that was how it was depicted?
I think there's probably a couple of elements as to why that happened. I would say that the first one is obviously an important, I guess, thing for remember with a lot of media representation is that what you can attribute to any kind of malice or any sort of failing might also just be attributed to laziness, wherein it's kind of just easier for a story to just have someone magically transform over a single scene than to have it stretched out, because then you can just kind of quickly move on to the points that you want to make or the jokes that you want to do. So I think that's far easier than having to be like, okay, well, to do this properly, we need to stretch this transition out over multiple episodes that cover multiple months. It's like, well, or we could just do this in a sort of single scene. They go into a surgery room, they come out of the surgery room, it's all done. And that way we can kind of just move quickly through that. I'd say that for the consideration of the other side of that would be that for a lot of the cis media, they didn't get to see that, didn't get to see and probably didn't put in the effort to look up what transitioning actually was like. As far as they were concerned, what they often saw was just, here is what this person looks like now, and here is a picture of this person from 20 years ago. So they've gone from this to this, and that's what we're going to publish in the newspaper, is we're going to publish these two pictures side by side, because that's the simplest way, if we think, of explaining the story or getting this idea across of what they used to look like. I think you can see that when you look up old articles about Christine Jorgensen, I think it was. Christine Jorgensen? G.I. Joe to Beauty or something. Where effectively they were using photos of Christine Jorgensen during her service, and then pictures of her as she was about 10 years after. And I was like, well, this was what the media was all spinning it as.
I see. And that's really interesting, because I took that just to be the kind of shock value element. But you're right. I mean, in terms of storytelling, the fewer pictures, the better. And there's no, quicker way to before and after. The portrayal of a journey from one place to another is quite literally just needs two photos, where you started and where you're at. And that's fascinating. I guess we see that in other things, like a lot of the old-fashioned 90s kind of weight loss pictures of, where someone's weight was and where it is now. And that's obviously, again, the same story, completely missing the journey. And that's fascinating.
You think one of the most popular trans subreddits for a period of time, and I think it still possibly is the transition timelines or transition timelines subreddit, where effectively the whole core of that was almost the same thing as those newspapers. It was people doing their own version of that with here's a photo of me from 10 years ago, here's a photo of me now. And that one was almost, in part, it was a mixture of people who were posting it because they wanted to in some way show off their own success that they've had in transitioning. It was posted there for other people to look at and go, oh, well, if this person could do this, then there's an inspiration to that thing. And I'm sure, because this is the internet, and it's like with anything like Instagrams or whatever, there were probably a contingent of people who were looking at those photos and were feeling bad about it because maybe they were not having a transition that was so fulfilling or positive that they wanted to show off.
Yeah, I think that, again, that goes into another thing of what can't be depicted with the before and after photos. It's the fact that there's a physical element to transitioning. There's an age element as well, like how many years of puberty you have or haven't gone through can affect certain things, and it's which, again, it's a whole other topic which I'm happy to talk about, but I want to be aware of your time. And so rounding off then, I just would love to touch on your Twitter account. I don't have Twitter, I never have, and with recent few months, I have no inclination to start trying to build up a little following on X. But I was really interested to see your profile and how it seemed like the same kind of humor that you have within your videos, that I don't want to say dry, since I don't know how you would describe your own humor, I don't want to tell you that, but it just seemed like a very fun political kind of narrative. Do you feel like you can express yourself easier on Twitter or X, whatever it's called, and do you enjoy that more, or do you prefer standing in front of a camera and creating a YouTube video?
So yeah, with the Twitter thing, it has to be sort of seen as like how I approached the Twitter thing, or how I kind of went into that compared to the YouTube channel that I'm doing now, which is the current channel that I'm running has only really been a channel that I'm effectively running full steam for the past year or so. And the Twitter has been kind of active for almost, I think, 3 years now. So that one was really active during one of my older channels, which was a lot more attempting to be a political commentator channel kind of thing, very involved in the idea of breadtube, as it were, back then, which I'm not super involved with right now because I feel like it kind of died as a concept, or sort of got tedious as a concept. So the Twitter kind of evolved out of that, and I mean, like, there was a period of like a year or so where I was attempting to post stuff on the Twitter that was designed to get lots and lots of likes and to be lots of engagement, which was, I mean, realistically, it was just me reposting content that was going to do well, because Twitter is ultimately it's not a content creator site, it's just a place that people like to go and meaninglessly blather stuff, and occasionally people will post like actually useful videos for resourcing from like events like Black Lives Matter or the current Palestine-Israel war. So there's like useful stuff like that, but for the most part what people like myself are doing on there is just spouting random crap, which is why I think it's much more akin to me just typing whatever. And I have been a lot more, I know it's not quiet, but I haven't used it a lot for the past like 3 or 4 months because I've been more involved with the YouTube stuff, which is actually engaging. It's actually something that I enjoy doing and does feel like content creation rather than just doing stuff for engagement and the idea of getting people liking my stuff.
That's fascinating. It's fascinating to hear that depiction, because with YouTube there's a lot of, as you've said as well, you have to create content in mind for it to be engaging, but at the same time creating good content is going to be engaging, and creating good content is fun. So there's this kind of this weird link of like the sweet point where if you're making good content that you enjoy making and people are liking it, then that's just life goals, isn't it, really?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's that, and there is a small bit of that where I think it is. I think this is the goal of a lot of, not necessarily goal, I guess, but it's the underlying goal for a lot of artists, is that whole like vibe when they're doing it as a hobby of, it would be nice to be able to do this for a living, to be able to come home and to do this as my work, and to be able to do what I enjoy doing and get paid to do it. Which is obviously, it's like many art forms, it's very unreliable. It's very sort of random as to where you get the money for that from, or how you get paid for that. And it is obviously, like a lot of art, very hard to be commercially successful. Very few people get to that point. I mean, it's the kind of crazy thing of like, the channel as where it's currently stands doesn't feel like a big channel. It's only 75,000 subscribers or whatever it's at now. But then when you crunch the numbers, that's sort of 1% of like all channels, or 0.1 or something crazy like that. It's like, oh, okay, so this is very lucky to have this happen.
Absolutely, you're in the top mega 1% of all creators, and that hierarchy is quite sad to digest, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, congratulations, and again, it's a perfect time for me to say again, thank you for your time, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
No worries. Thank you for having me here. It was great to be here, and we can do a follow-up interview in a year's time and see where the channel's at then, and hope maybe there's additional questions or something then at some point.
Yeah, I would love that. I'm actually going to hold you to that and put a date in my calendar, as optimistic as it is. And it'd be great to compare where the media representation of trans people and the trans community has gone, especially if we're after the 2024 elections in the US. Gosh, heaven forbid.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. This is lovely.
You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Finally, I will just ask, if you've enjoyed this content and if you enjoy my channel, if you're not a member already and if you're not a patron, I would encourage you, if you can, if you have the budget, just about £2 a month, to join as a patron. You will get access to a whole bunch of extra content. There is updates of what's happening. You get early access to all of my videos. I really am trying to grow the channel. But I will also always like to add to say, not everyone has the financial capability of helping, and I completely understand that. You are helping by watching my videos in full, by commenting long paragraphs and talking about what your thoughts were. You are helping me by engaging, and if you have someone like-minded to you, sharing my channel with them and getting them to join as well.